The sun beat down on the Santa Monica Pier, where families laughed and music filled the air, blending with the scent of fresh popcorn and salt water. The boardwalk was alive, packed with tourists, children running past and couples hand in hand, enjoying the energy of the place. But among them, a young woman sat alone in her wheelchair by the carousel, her eyes scanning the crowd, feeling like an outsider in a world that didn't seem to have room for her anymore. Deann White had once loved this place, the same pier where she'd spent countless sunny afternoons with friends, feeling the breeze whip through her hair. But now every glance from a stranger seemed to remind her of the life she'd lost, a life that felt like it was slipping further out of reach with each passing day. The sound of the Ferris wheel turning, the hum of a nearby street performer strumming his guitar, it all felt too familiar, yet too distant. The laughter of children echoed in her ears, but in her wheelchair, Deann couldn't help but feel trapped by the stares that followed her, the whispers that rose when people thought she couldn't hear. She longed to feel like everyone else again, to blend into the crowd and forget the reality of her condition. But every glance, every uncomfortable pause from strangers, reminded her of her paralysis, reminded her that she was different. She was just trying to enjoy the day, to reclaim a moment of normalcy, but the world around her felt like a constant reminder that she didn't belong. It didn't take long for the disruption to begin. Across the boardwalk, three young men locked eyes with Deann. They were loud, swaggering, acting like they owned the pier, their voices cutting through the cheerful hum of the crowd. One wore a bright floral shirt, his chest puffed out, tattoos sprawling down his arms. The other two wore worn denim vests, and they couldn't help but sneer as they approached her. She'd been expecting it, she always did, but it still sent a chill through her as they slowed down in front of her chair. They didn't stop at the usual insults. No, they had something crueler in mind today. "Move, cripple," one of them sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. Deann felt the words cut through her, but before she could react, the man in the floral shirt kicked the wheel of her chair, jolting her body as it teetered dangerously. Her hands shot out instinctively to catch herself, but a wave of humiliation washed over her. The crowd around her, this same crowd that had once brought her joy, remained still, indifferent. Her heart sank, not from the kick, but from the silence. No one stepped in to help. Before we continue, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more exciting stories that you won't want to miss. Deann could feel the eyes on her, even though she tried to keep her gaze straight ahead. The sound of laughter and the hum of the crowd faded in the background as the three young men continued to approach. She felt their presence before she saw them, a weight in the air that made her stomach tighten. The man in the floral shirt was the first to speak, his voice loud and sharp, cutting through the festive noise. "What's the matter, sweetheart?" he sneered, his grin wide. "Did your legs just stop working or what?" Deann's hands tightened on the wheels of her chair, her knuckles white. She fought the sting of the words, trying to focus on the happy chatter around her, on the memories of coming to the pier when she was young, when everything had felt so different. But it was hard to ignore the mockery, the sneers that came with each passing moment. One of the men, the one in a faded denim vest, nudged her chair lightly with his boot, as if testing the waters. The movement was so subtle, but it sent a jolt through her body, and she instinctively gripped the handles tighter to steady herself. She had learned long ago how to deal with teasing, the rude comments, the stares, but this was different. There was a maliciousness behind their words, a coldness that made her stomach twist. "Bet you can't even get up without help," the guy in the vest chuckled, and the others laughed in response. Deann swallowed hard, fighting the tears that burned at the back of her throat. She refused to let them see her break, but the pressure of it all, the laughter, the stares, the feeling of being less than human, was starting to suffocate her. The man in the floral shirt leaned down, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and foul. "Move, cripple," he spat, his words cutting through the air like a blade. Deann's heart skipped a beat, and she felt the harsh sting of humiliation spread through her chest, seeping into her bones. Her chair shifted slightly under the weight of his push, and the sudden force of it almost sent her tumbling sideways. Her breath caught in her throat, Her hands clutched the wheel with a desperation that made her fingertips ache. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Deann's heart pounded in her chest, and the sounds of the pier, the music, the laughter, the bustling crowd, faded into a distant hum. The only thing she could focus on was the cold look in the man's eyes, the cruelty that dripped from every word he uttered. She had hoped, even just for a moment, that this time would be different. That she could slip under the radar, be just another face in the crowd. But instead, here she was, right back where she had always feared, vulnerable, helpless, exposed. And then it happened. Michael Owings, the largest of the three men, took a step forward, his heavy boots thudding on the wood of the pier. He was taller than the others, his broad shoulders filling the space in front of her, his presence overpowering. Deann barely had time to react before he lifted his foot and swung it toward her chair. The sound of his boot connecting with the wheel was deafening, and the jolt sent a shockwave of fear and pain through her body. Her heart raced, and her arms, already fatigued from gripping the chair, struggled to keep her upright. The chair wobbled dangerously, and for a moment, Deann thought she was going to fall. The crowd around her seemed to vanish into nothingness, their indifference like a thick fog. The bullies laughed, their voices loud and triumphant, their cruel words bouncing off the pier like stones. But it was the silence of the onlookers that cut through Deann the most. She turned her head, hoping, just hoping, someone would step forward, would do something. But no one moved. People stared, some even lifted their phones, recording the moment as if it were just another piece of entertainment. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. They were watching, and no one cared enough to stop it. Her worst fear, the one she'd held on to since the accident, had come true. She was invisible. A spectacle to be mocked, nothing more than a sideshow. The cruelty from the men was painful, yes, but it was the coldness of the crowd, the unwillingness to even acknowledge her suffering, that shattered something deep inside her. The humiliation stung, but the silence, the indifference of those around her, was the real blow. Deann's pulse raced in her ears as she stared at the people around her, waiting for someone to make a move, to step in. But there was only the sound of laughter, the grinding of her chair's wheels, and the cruel mocking that followed her like a shadow. Tears threatened to spill over, but Deann forced herself to stay still. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. She wouldn't show them her weakness, even if they had already stripped away her dignity. Instead, she clenched her fists in her lap, her nails digging into her palms. She refused to let them break her, refused to let them win. But just as she thought she couldn't take it any longer, the air shifted. The sound of motorcycles rumbled in the distance, slowly at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Deann's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she wondered if her mind was playing tricks on her. But no, the sound was real. The vibrations of the engines seemed to shake the pier beneath her, and the laughter of the bullies faltered. Their grins turned into uncertain glances, and for the first time, they hesitated. One by one, motorcycles appeared at the end of the pier, their engines roaring like thunder. Deann's heart raced, but this time, it wasn't from fear. No, this was something different. Something that made her stomach flip with a strange sense of hope. The bikers rolled in, dozens of them, each clad in black leather and helmets. Tattoos told the story of lives lived rough, but it was the sheer presence of them, the unity, that made her breathe easier. This was not just a group of bikers. This was something bigger, something powerful. As the bikers dismounted, Deann could see their faces, grim, but determined. Their eyes locked onto the bullies, and she could feel the shift in the air. The men who had once seemed so powerful, so certain of themselves, now shrank back. The bikers moved with purpose, surrounding the bullies and blocking Deann from view. It wasn't violent, it wasn't chaotic, but it was clear. They weren't there to watch, they were there to protect. And just like that, the tide began to turn. Deann's heart was still racing, but now it was a different kind of anxiety, one born from a feeling of isolation so thick she could barely breathe. She had tried to keep it together, tried to ignore the cruel laughter that continued to echo in her ears, but it was impossible now. The three men's mocking voices seemed to fade, their presence becoming an overwhelming weight pressing down on her. The crowd around her remained unmoved, watching as though they were spectators at a game, their eyes gliding over her as if she were invisible. The chair felt like a cage, each push of the wheel a futile attempt to escape the moment, but her arms were heavy, her spirit even heavier. Just as she thought she couldn't endure another second of this humiliation, a deep rumble vibrated through the pier. The air shifted, thickened with the sound of engines revving, rolling in from the street like the prelude to a storm. Deann's eyes widened, her head snapping toward the source of the noise, but the bullies didn't notice at first, they were too caught up in their taunts. The loud roar of the motorcycles grew louder and louder, crashing over the mocking voices like a flood breaking through a dam. It was impossible to ignore now, the deep vibration beneath her wheels, the rhythmic growl of something much bigger than the petty cruelty of the men in front of her. The first motorcycle appeared, chrome glinting under the California sun, its engine growling like a beast. It was followed by another, and then another, and soon a whole wave of bikers came pouring down the pier toward the crowd. The sound was deafening, like a storm on the horizon, and for the first time, Deann felt the oppressive weight of her humiliation lift, replaced by a strange sense of hope. The bikers were an overwhelming presence, broad-shouldered, clad in black leather, their faces hidden behind dark visors and worn caps. Each one was a mountain of muscle and grit, their movements purposeful, united, and filled with a quiet intensity that made the world around them feel smaller. At the front of the group, leading them with an effortless grace, was Carmen Fanucci. He was different from the others. While the bikers were intimidating in their own right, Carmen stood apart. His imposing figure, with the cold authority of someone who had long commanded respect, seemed to draw the attention of the entire pier. He was older than the rest, maybe in his late 40s, his face etched with the lines of someone who had lived a hard life. His eyes, dark and steady, scanned the scene before him with an air of absolute control. Carmen's presence was magnetic, a force that made everything around him feel like it had just shifted, like the balance of power had changed. As the bikers continued to pour into the pier, the men who had harassed Deann froze. The loud, swaggering arrogance that had filled their voices just moments ago faltered, and the air around them seemed to thicken. Michael Owings, the largest of the three, glanced over at his friends, his bravado slipping away as his eyes widened in realization. His chest, once puffed out in mock confidence, seemed to shrink, as if the weight of the bikers' arrival had sucked all the air from his lungs. The men, who had been so cruel just moments before, now looked like nervous children, their confident postures replaced by uncertainty and fear. They shifted on their feet, looking for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. Carmen Fanucci, standing at the front of the group, didn't need to say a word. His mere presence sent ripples through the bullies' ranks. Carmen's cold gaze swept over them, and in that instant, the atmosphere shifted. The bikers didn't shout, didn't make any threatening gestures, they didn't need to. The air was charged with an unspoken promise. These men, these bikers, would not stand by while cruelty unfolded. The silent message was loud enough to be heard by everyone within range. This is not your fight anymore. You will not touch her again. The bullies seemed to shrink in size under the weight of Carmen's stare. Michael Owings took an uncertain step back, his confident grin replaced by a nervous flicker in his eyes. His hands, which had previously been clenched in fists, now hung limp at his sides, the arrogance that had fueled him fading away. The other two men shifted their weight, nervously looking from Carmen to each other. It was as though they had suddenly realized they were facing something far bigger than their petty cruelty, something they couldn't fight with words or threats. They were cornered, not by force, but by presence. Deann, who had been struggling to hold back tears, now found her breath coming in shallow bursts. She looked around, seeing the bikers surround her in an invisible barrier. The men who had tormented her just moments before now stood frozen, their faces pale, their eyes darting toward Carmen as if searching for permission to move. Carmen didn't speak, didn't gesture, but the effect was undeniable. The bullies were being swallowed up by the sheer force of the bikers' silent unity, unable to act, unable to speak, reduced to nothing more than spectators in a game they no longer controlled. For Deann, the moment felt almost surreal. It was as though the world had slowed down around her, and for the first time, she wasn't alone. She wasn't the target, the victim, she was protected. The bikers didn't need to be loud or aggressive to shield her. Their presence alone was enough. The silence in the air spoke louder than any words could ever. Deann found herself staring up at Carmen, her eyes wide with confusion and relief. What was happening? Who were these people and why were they protecting her? The crowd around them, which had once been so indifferent, now seemed to be holding its collective breath. Eyes flicked nervously between Carmen and the bullies, sensing that the situation was on the verge of something bigger. People were starting to whisper, some even pointing their phones toward the bikers, eager to capture this unexpected confrontation. The once jovial atmosphere of the pier had shifted into something charged, something full of suspense. But for Deann, all she could focus on was the fact that the man who had been cruel to her moments before was now shrinking back in fear. And that, in itself, was a victory. Have you ever experienced a moment where an unexpected person or group stepped in to protect you in a way you didn't see coming? How did it change your perspective on the situation? If you believe kindness and strength can come from the most unlikely places, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of unexpected courage and compassion. The air around Deann seemed to grow colder, thick with tension as the bikers closed in. Carmen Fanucci stood in the center of the group, silent and unmoving, his presence a force that none of the bullies could ignore. His eyes locked onto Michael Owings, unblinking and cold, a silent challenge that seemed to reverberate through the very air. There were no threats, no harsh words, just the weight of his gaze, as if he could see right through the arrogance and bravado the young men had been so quick to display. It was enough to make Michael take a hesitant step back, his confidence crumbling like a building with no foundation. The bikers fanned out around Deann, their posture defensive, their faces hard, but there was no movement, no aggression. The collective presence of the Mafia, their unity and the quiet power they exuded, was enough to put the bullies on edge. It wasn't the threat of violence that made the men falter, it was the overwhelming certainty that they were no longer in control. Deann felt her heart rate slow as she realized the bikers weren't just surrounding her physically. They were creating an invisible barrier, a shield that kept her safe from the cruel, hate-filled words that had been hurled at her just moments before. Deann's eyes flicked from the bullies to the bikers, her pulse still erratic from the adrenaline, but there was something different now. A shift. For the first time, she didn't feel like a target. She wasn't the vulnerable one anymore. The bikers, with their silent, unyielding presence, had become her protectors, offering her something more than just physical safety. They had given her a sense of dignity that she hadn't felt in so long. Their collective stillness spoke volumes, and in the way they stood, guarding her from all sides, Deann realized that this moment wasn't just about her, it was about respect, about not allowing anyone to be diminished. The men who had tormented her stood frozen, their previous mockery fading into uncertain murmurs. Michael Owings, the one who had kicked her wheelchair, stepped forward again, but this time, he didn't seem so sure of himself. His swagger had evaporated, replaced by a thin veneer of bravado that could barely conceal the fear in his eyes. He moved closer to Deann, but his steps were hesitant, like a man walking into the unknown. He shot a quick glance at Carmen and the other bikers, the chill in the air unmistakable. The Mafia's collective presence had drained him of whatever courage he'd had moments before. He took another step, this time slower, his chest still puffed out but his face ashen. The sound of his boots on the wood was deafening in the silence, and the tension in the air was thick enough to slice through. Carmen didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge the challenge Michael tried to present. The Mafia boss stood, solid and unwavering, his eyes still locked on the young man like an immovable force. For a moment, Michael seemed to hesitate, his bravado faltering as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The collective strength of the bikers had become a wall. Michael Owings took one more step forward, but it was almost as if he couldn't breathe anymore. The sheer calmness of Carmen's stance, the unspoken power that emanated from him, was too much for him to ignore. He stopped, his body stiffening as he realized that the game had changed. The arrogance that had once filled his movements was gone, replaced by a palpable fear that spread like wildfire among the bullies. They were no longer in control of this situation. Deann wasn't their target anymore. She had become the witness to their humiliation, and the tables had turned. For a split second, Deann's mind raced. She'd seen this before, this sudden shift of power. She had been the one who was invisible, the one who had always been at the mercy of others. But now, for the first time, she saw that power could shift in her favor. She felt the weight of the Mafia's presence as something comforting, something strong. They were protecting her, but not just from the bullies. They were protecting her from the fear that had plagued her since the accident, the fear that had made her shrink back into herself. Carmen Fanucci and his bikers had given her something invaluable, the ability to stand tall, even while sitting down. They had given her back her dignity. The bullies, seeing the fear in Michael's eyes and the unyielding force in the bikers' silence, knew they were beaten. They exchanged glances, their earlier bravado evaporating in the wake of the Mafia's cold gaze. Michael muttered something under his breath, his words barely audible, but they were enough for the others to get the message. The fight was over. They were outmatched, outclassed, and out of options. Without another word, the three of them backed away, stepping back into the crowd with the same uncertain expressions that had marked their faces for the last few moments. The sound of their retreat was almost drowned out by the silence that followed, but Deann could hear their footsteps, fading as they disappeared into the distance. The bullies had been vanquished not by force, but by presence. Carmen had never needed to raise a fist. The Mafia's power had been in their unity, their silence, and the strength of their collective will. They had shown the bullies, and the entire pier, that cruelty would not be tolerated. As the last of the bullies disappeared, Deann's breathing finally slowed. She hadn't realized she was holding her breath, her chest tight with the lingering effects of the humiliation and fear that had been building inside her. But now, in the aftermath, she felt something different. She felt safe. She wasn't just another person in the crowd anymore. She wasn't just a target for ridicule. The bikers, the Mafia, had made sure of that. The Mafia's presence had given her something she hadn't realized she needed until now: protection. Not just from the bullies, but from the silence of a world that had always left her to fend for herself. Deann turned her gaze to Carmen, who was still standing where he had been, watching her with those steady, cold eyes. For a moment, there was a flicker of something almost tender in his gaze, but it was gone before she could fully comprehend it. Carmen didn't smile. He didn't need to. He had done more with his silence than anyone could do with words. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time seen. Not as a burden, not as someone to be pitied, but as a person worthy of respect. The air remained thick with tension, but something had shifted. Carmen Fanucci had remained silent up until this point, a quiet storm in the middle of the pier, but now, the stillness around him became almost palpable. Slowly, as if he were moving through a different world than the rest of them, he took a single step forward. The action was simple, but it was enough to make everyone around him pause, the shift in energy immediate. His presence seemed to fill the space, more powerful than any shout or command could ever hope to be. Even the bullies, who had been so defiant moments ago, recoiled at the weight of it, their earlier arrogance evaporating into thin air. Carmen's slow, deliberate steps brought him closer to the men who had once mocked Deann, but no words left his lips. He didn't need them. Every movement he made was full of purpose, each one carrying the unspoken message that this was no longer their game to play. Michael Owings took a shaky step backward, his hand subconsciously reaching for his jacket, his eyes darting from Carmen to his two friends. The others, once brimming with bravado, now stood uncertain, their previous cocky grins gone, replaced by unease. It was clear that they didn't understand the gravity of the situation until Carmen took another step, his gaze like a force of nature, commanding respect with nothing more than a glance. They had lost. As Carmen moved, The bikers fell in line behind him, their collective presence forming a wall between Deann and her tormentors. It wasn't the sound of clashing fists or shouting that signaled the end of the conflict, it was the quietude, the overwhelming silence that wrapped around them all like a protective shield. Carmen's eyes flicked to the bullies one last time, a warning without words, and without another moment's hesitation, they turned and scurried off, retreating back into the crowd. The tension began to dissipate as quickly as it had come, replaced by an eerie calm. The bikers, still standing tall, had not moved, but now Deann could feel the world shifting again, the oppressive weight of her fear starting to lift. Carmen stood still, his back straight and posture unyielding, yet there was something else in his eyes now, a softness that Deann hadn't noticed before. He had been the commanding presence, the leader of the group, but now, as the last of the bullies disappeared, his energy shifted. He turned toward Deann, and the intensity of his gaze softened, becoming almost tender. Slowly, he moved toward her, his steps measured and purposeful. The other bikers, still standing guard, allowed Carmen this moment of connection, knowing that their leader had a different role to play now. When Carmen reached Deann, he didn't speak immediately. Instead, he lowered himself slightly, crouching down until he was at her level. His movements were slow, deliberate, and Deann could feel her pulse still racing, but in a different way now, less from fear, more from the unexpected kindness she saw in his eyes. Carmen's deep, gravelly voice broke the silence, low and gentle, "You're safe now." The words were simple, but the weight behind them settled over Deann like a warm blanket. There was nothing grand about the way he spoke, no theatrical gestures or demands. It was the sincerity in his voice, the calm authority he exuded, that made those words feel like a promise, a reassurance she hadn't realized she was craving until now. Deann blinked rapidly, struggling to keep her emotions in check. She hadn't realized how badly she needed to hear that, needed to feel it. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to breathe, really breathe, and the heaviness that had settled on her chest seemed to lighten. Carmen hadn't offered pity, and he hadn't offered some grand speech about heroism. He had simply shown up, stood there, and in the quiet of his presence, made her feel safe. The bikers around her began to shift subtly, their body language mirroring the leader's silent support. One by one, they offered small gestures of solidarity. One biker gave Deann a thumbs up, while another gently patted her shoulder as they walked by. Each small interaction, a subtle show of kindness, made her feel part of something bigger, something that wasn't just about a group of bikers or even about her. It was about a moment of collective strength, of standing together when someone was in need. Deann hadn't expected to find any kind of camaraderie in a group like this, but now, as each biker moved past her, she realized that she was no longer alone. Her isolation had begun to dissipate, slowly replaced by a new sense of belonging. The bikers, who had once seemed so foreign to her, now felt like guardians of a kind, unwavering tribe, united by their unspoken code. It wasn't just about protection, it was about respect. They didn't see her as a victim, but as someone worth standing up for. They didn't treat her with pity. Instead, they treated her as a person deserving of dignity and respect. And that, more than anything else, made her feel, for the first time in what seemed like forever, truly seen. As Carmen stood, Deann could feel the shift in the energy around her, the way the bikers no longer looked at her with pity, but with a quiet acknowledgement. It wasn't a grand gesture or a declaration, but something far deeper and more meaningful. The Mafia had offered her not just protection, but a new understanding of what it meant to be seen. And in that quiet understanding, Deann felt herself change too. She was no longer defined by her wheelchair or the people who had mocked her. She was now part of a world where strength, not weakness, was the foundation of the connection. Have you ever had a moment where someone's quiet presence and words made you feel seen and protected in a way that changed how you saw yourself? If you believe that sometimes the simplest gestures can create the strongest bonds, leave a comment below with your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of strength, support, and solidarity. The shift in atmosphere was subtle at first, like a breeze before a storm. At first, it was just the quiet mutterings of people who had witnessed the confrontation, whispers that grew louder as the bikers stood their ground. But soon, it became more than just murmurs. People began to speak up, exchanging words about what had just happened, about the power of the moment. Then, almost as if a single signal had been given, a round of applause broke out. It started with one person, a man in a Hawaiian shirt who had been watching from a bench, and then the sound spread, like wildfire, catching the attention of others who had stood frozen, watching in silence. The applause wasn't loud or boisterous, but it was powerful, a recognition of what had transpired, of the protection that had been offered to Deann when no one else had stepped in. Deann's eyes widened as the crowd's reaction washed over her. She hadn't expected this. She had braced herself for more ridicule, for the continued isolation that she had grown accustomed to. But this was something completely unexpected. As the bullies turned and walked away, their shoulders slumped, their pride shattered, Deann couldn't help but feel a flicker of something inside her, a strange warmth she had long forgotten. The crowd's reaction wasn't one of shame or judgment, but rather one of support, a collective recognition that what had happened was wrong and that what the bikers had done was right. The indifference she had always feared had disappeared, replaced by a surprising sense of unity. The bullies slunk off the pier, their heads down and their feet dragging behind them, a stark contrast to the swagger they had carried just moments before. Their retreat was not graceful, but defeated. Every step they took was like a retreat from their own arrogance, a walk of shame in front of the very people they had tried to belittle. Deann could hear the whispers around her, people talking among themselves, sharing the story of the bikers' intervention. For the first time, it wasn't her that people were talking about in hushed tones, it was the bullies. The shift in power was palpable. In that moment, Deann's mind began to shift as well. She realized, with a slow dawning clarity, that the events that had unfolded before her were more than just an act of intervention. The bikers had shown her something deeper, a quiet kind of kindness that didn't ask for recognition, a protection that didn't need to be loud or boisterous to make an impact. She had spent so much time feeling like an outsider, as if the world was a place she couldn't fully belong. But the bikers, in their simple yet powerful way, had reminded her of something she had long forgotten. Kindness, when shown at the right moment, could change everything. Her fear of being an outcast, of being unnoticed, began to melt away as she understood that solidarity could come from the most unexpected places. The bikers had shown her that standing up for someone wasn't about grand gestures or speeches, it was about showing up, about creating space for others to exist without fear. Deann had always thought that her worth was defined by her ability to blend in, by her capacity to conform to the expectations of those around her. But now she realized that her worth wasn't tied to blending in, it was tied to standing tall, even in the face of adversity. The bikers had given her something invaluable, a reminder that she was never truly alone, that there were people willing to fight for her, even without her asking. As the applause continued to echo in her ears, Deann could feel the weight of her previous isolation lifting, replaced by something stronger, connection. It wasn't just the bikers who had shown her solidarity, it was the crowd that had watched, that had chosen to stand with her by recognizing the rightness of the bikers' actions. The indifference that had always made her feel invisible was slowly being replaced by a recognition that she was seen, valued, and protected. For the first time, she realized how much that mattered. The presence of the Mafia, the quiet power they held, had shifted the dynamics on the pier in ways she never could have imagined. It wasn't just the intervention, it was the way they had done it. There had been no violence, no chaos, just the raw, unspoken authority of Carmen and his bikers. The way they had silently surrounded her, without a word, without a single threat, was a lesson in power. It wasn't the kind of power that came from force or dominance. It was the power of unity, of standing firm in the face of cruelty and saying, "This will not stand." Carmen's leadership had shown her that sometimes silence could be more powerful than the loudest shouts. His stillness, his unwavering confidence, had turned the tide. The bikers didn't need to announce their intentions or make a spectacle of their protection. The mere fact of their presence, standing shoulder to shoulder, had spoken louder than anything else could. Deann could see now that their power wasn't in the noise they made, but in the quiet assurance that they would not let anyone suffer alone. Carmen had led with strength, but it was a strength that came from within, from a code of loyalty and respect that transcended words. This wasn't just a random act of kindness, it was a fundamental belief that no one should be left to fend for themselves in a world that so often seemed indifferent. As Deann took in the scene around her, her heart felt full in a way it hadn't for a long time. She was no longer a bystander in her own life. She had been seen, defended, and respected. The bikers, Carmen, had restored her faith, not just in herself, but in humanity. For all the cruelty and indifference she had witnessed, this one act of solidarity had shown her that there was still hope, that there was still room for kindness in the world. The crowd began to disperse slowly, but Deann remained where she was, her thoughts swirling. She wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time, she felt like she could face whatever came her way. She was no longer just the girl in the wheelchair. She was someone worth protecting, someone whose presence mattered. The world felt different now, not perfect, but not as cold as it had seemed before. She wasn't just another victim to be looked away from. She was someone who deserved respect, and maybe, just maybe, the world was ready to give it to her. As Deann sat quietly in the wake of the confrontation, the bustling sounds of the pier gradually returned to her ears, but the world around her felt different now. The applause had died down, the bullies had slinked off in defeat, and the bikers, standing strong in their unity, had begun to disperse as well. But Deann remained in her chair, her mind still processing the incredible events that had unfolded in front of her. She had spent so much of her life feeling like an outsider, unseen and unnoticed, that the sheer force of what had just happened was overwhelming. Carmen Fanucci and his crew had not only protected her from physical harm, they had done something deeper, something that was still settling into her heart. They had made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. Deann thought back to the way Carmen had moved through the crowd with quiet power, how the bikers hadn't needed to speak a single word to make their intentions clear. In that moment, she had expected to be ignored or treated as weak, but what she had gotten instead was something entirely unexpected: respect. These were men and women who, by all accounts, could have been just as cruel as the bullies who had tormented her. The Mafia was a group typically seen as dangerous and violent by society's standards, a force that thrived on intimidation and fear. Yet, in that moment, they had shown her a form of kindness she had never experienced before. The very people she had once feared had now offered her protection, and in doing so, they had shattered the image she had held of them. It was a paradox that Deann couldn't quite wrap her mind around. The Mafia, men and women known for their power, their ruthlessness, had come to her aid without hesitation. Carmen, in particular, had given her something she had never expected: dignity. The world had always painted people like Carmen as the enemy, but she realized now that kindness could come from the most unexpected places. She had never thought that a group like this would be capable of understanding the need for compassion, let alone acting on it. The question lingered in her mind: how could they, who lived a life so often dictated by violence and control, understand the importance of simply being there for someone? As she sat in silence, reflecting on what had happened, Deann felt a presence at her side. Carmen had returned, walking toward her with the same deliberate, measured steps that had commanded attention when he first arrived. His cold, calculating exterior remained, but there was something softer in his eyes now, something that didn't demand fear but rather understanding. Deann hadn't expected him to approach her again, not after the way he had intervened so decisively. But here he was, standing in front of her, the weight of his presence somehow reassuring. Without a word, Carmen crouched down, bringing himself to her eye level, his expression serious, but not unkind. "You're stronger than you know," he said softly, his gravelly voice carrying a quiet weight that resonated deep inside her. Deann blinked, momentarily taken aback by the simplicity of his words. There was nothing grand or theatrical in his statement, just the truth, unadorned and straightforward. But it was enough. It was the first time in a long while that someone had acknowledged her strength instead of pitying her weakness. Deann felt a rush of emotions flood through her: gratitude, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of relief. Carmen, this man who could have continued to walk past her like everyone else, had stopped, had taken the time to see her for who she really was. In that simple moment, she felt understood in a way she hadn't before. Carmen wasn't speaking out of obligation or kindness because it was expected of him. He was speaking because he genuinely saw something in her. And that acknowledgement, that simple recognition of her strength, was something Deann hadn't known she needed until it was given. She had been broken by the cruelty of the world, by the way people saw her as less than. But Carmen had reminded her that her value wasn't determined by what others thought of her. In the days that followed, Deann began to reflect more deeply on the bikers' actions and what they had represented. She started to understand the significance of what had occurred, not just for her, but for the people who had surrounded her. These weren't just bikers, they were part of a brotherhood, a tight-knit community that operated on a code of loyalty and respect. Carmen had made it clear that their actions weren't motivated by a desire for personal gain or to exert control over her. They had simply acted because it was the right thing to do. She began to realize that the Mafia's intervention wasn't just a singular act of protection, it was a reflection of the values they lived by, a code of honor that transcended their rough exteriors. The bikers, each one of them, had subtly shown their support in small ways: thumbs up, a pat on the back, a nod of acknowledgement. These gestures, though simple, were filled with meaning. Deann understood now that their solidarity went beyond just showing up when it mattered. It was a way of life, a way of standing together when the world tried to tear people apart. She wasn't just being protected from physical harm, she was being welcomed into this protective fold, into a world where loyalty wasn't just a word, it was a code they lived by. They had made her feel like she belonged, like she was worthy of being part of something bigger than herself. The more she thought about it, the more Deann realized that this was something she had always craved but never understood: true belonging. It wasn't about fitting in or conforming to others' expectations. It was about being accepted for who you were, no matter what had happened to you or where you came from. The bikers didn't ask for her past, and they didn't judge her for her disability. They simply recognized her as someone who deserved respect, just like anyone else. And in that simple act of acceptance, Deann found herself finally starting to heal. The ripple effect of the confrontation on the pier didn't end the moment the bullies walked away. Deann had hoped that the episode would simply fade into the past, a small victory in a world that often seemed indifferent. But as the bikers continued to stand their ground, a new wave of tension began to build in the shadows. Whispers spread quickly among the locals, and soon, the word of what had happened at the pier reached the wrong ears. The bullies had retreated, but their pride, already bruised, was not easily erased. Behind them, their friends and others in the area were more than willing to take up their cause. Not long after the incident, a local gang, known for its rough reputation, began to stir. They weren't looking for justice, they were looking for payback. Word had gotten to them that the bikers, the Mafia, had embarrassed their friends, and in their eyes, the bikers had crossed a line. These men were used to intimidation, to flexing their power in a world where the strong dominated. The bikers had made them look weak, and that simply couldn't stand. As the gang members gathered, their eyes turned toward the bikers with one goal in mind: retribution. But they didn't realize what they were getting into. The bikers, for their part, knew the threat was coming. Carmen had eyes and ears in every corner of the city, and the whispers had already reached him. Deann could see the shift in the bikers' demeanor as they began to prepare, the tension in their movements unmistakable. The sound of engines revving on the outskirts of the pier told her that something was about to go down. But Carmen didn't seem concerned. He remained calm, as composed as he had been during the confrontation with the bullies. His focus was steady, his eyes distant, as if he were calculating the best way to handle the situation without escalating it. Deann watched him closely, sensing the weight of his thoughts. She had expected him to take a more direct approach, to confront the gang with the same force and intensity he had shown earlier. But Carmen didn't rush. He didn't engage in the bluster that others might have. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his posture unwavering, his mind already calculating the most strategic way to address the situation. The Mafia wasn't a group that thrived on chaos. They thrived on control, on knowing when to strike and when to wait. Carmen wasn't going to give the gang the satisfaction of a fight. Instead, he was going to teach them a lesson in something far more powerful: restraint. Wait, Carmen's voice was low, but it carried the authority of someone used to making life-and-death decisions. His command stopped the bikers from charging toward the gang, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. Carmen raised his hand, signaling them to hold their ground, his eyes never leaving the direction of the approaching gang. "This isn't our fight to win with force," he added, his voice calm yet firm. Deann was taken aback by the wisdom in his words. Carmen wasn't just a leader, he was a strategist, someone who understood the bigger picture. As the gang approached, Carmen's stillness only seemed to deepen. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even irritated. He was calculating, watching, waiting for the right moment. The gang's bravado continued to build as they neared the bikers, their leader shouting insults and challenges into the air. But Carmen simply stood there, unshaken. He let them come, let them get closer until they were standing in front of him. Then, with one fluid motion, he spoke, his voice low enough to carry only to those nearest him. "Do you really think you can intimidate us?" Carmen asked, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "You're welcome to try. But remember, you're not dealing with boys who need to prove themselves. We've already won." His words were simple, yet their impact was undeniable. The gang faltered for just a second, their confidence slipping as they faced this calm, unrelenting force. Carmen wasn't shouting, wasn't posturing. He was speaking with quiet authority, and in that moment, it was clear that the gang wasn't ready for what he had to offer. The gang leader stepped forward, his bravado still intact, but his posture had shifted slightly. The bikers didn't flinch, didn't make a move. Carmen's words hung in the air like a challenge, a warning wrapped in stillness. "We're not here to play games," Carmen said, his voice growing softer, but somehow more menacing. "If you think you're going to make something of this, you're welcome to try. But I'm not going to waste my time with you." The gang leader hesitated, his hand twitching slightly, and for a moment, the tension on the pier was unbearable. Then, as if a signal had been given, the gang began to back off. The cocky swagger that had filled them moments before evaporated, and they slinked away, their heads down, their mouths shut. The bikers didn't move. They didn't celebrate. They didn't need to. Carmen's words, his quiet authority, had been enough. The gang had realized, just like the bullies before them, that they were out of their depth. The bikers were not a group to be provoked, not because of their size or strength, but because of their unshakable calm. As the gang melted back into the crowd, Deann could hardly believe what she had just witnessed. Carmen had done it again, not through violence, not through intimidation, but through an effortless display of control. The Mafia's true strength lay in their ability to navigate situations with wisdom and restraint. They could have easily taken the bait, could have thrown punches, and yet they had chosen a higher path. In doing so, Carmen had shown Deann that power wasn't about force, it was about knowing when not to fight, when to let the enemy reveal their own weakness. Deann realized that the bikers, the Mafia, had taught her a valuable lesson. The world didn't need more violence to solve problems, it needed wisdom, it needed strength of character. Carmen and his crew had faced down danger not with fists, but with an unspoken strength that everyone around them had recognized. And Deann, sitting quietly in her chair, understood now that she didn't need to fight for respect, because the bikers had shown her how to command it without ever raising a hand. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between reacting impulsively and showing restraint? How did that decision affect the outcome? If you believe that sometimes the most powerful action is choosing not to act at all, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the strength that comes from wisdom and restraint. The days that followed the confrontation at the pier were a whirlwind of emotions for Deann. At first, she wasn't sure what to make of it all, the kindness, the protection, the way the world seemed to shift around her. But slowly, as time passed, she began to feel something she hadn't felt in years: confidence. Each morning, she awoke with a new sense of self, a strength that had been hidden beneath layers of fear and self-doubt. The bullies, the ones who had once made her feel small and insignificant, seemed so distant now, as if their cruelty had never truly touched her. She realized that the protection she had received on the pier wasn't just about being shielded from harm, it was about standing up for what was right. Deann's reflection on what had happened made her understand the deeper impact of the bikers' actions. It wasn't the physical protection alone that had given her strength, it was the message behind it. Carmen and his crew had shown her that standing up for someone, especially when it's difficult or uncomfortable, is a powerful act. They hadn't acted out of pity or obligation, but out of a sense of justice, a desire to protect what was right. That simple act of standing between her and the bullies had ignited something in Deann. She wasn't just protected, she was empowered. She now saw herself not as a victim to be pitied, but as someone capable of facing the world on her own terms. But with this newfound strength came a new challenge: the fear of returning to the place that had caused her so much pain. The Santa Monica Pier. It had once been a place of joy for her, but now, every time she thought of it, she remembered the laughter of the bullies, the cruelty, the sting of their words. It had been a battleground, a reminder of everything that had made her feel invisible. Yet, as the days passed and her confidence grew, the weight of that fear began to feel lighter. She realized that the pier, the place where she had been humiliated, was also the place where she had gained her strength back. It was time to return, but this time, she wouldn't shrink away. When Deann finally made her way back to the pier, the familiar sounds and sights greeted her, but this time, they didn't feel the same. She didn't feel like an outsider, like she didn't belong. As she wheeled herself down the boardwalk, she noticed something she hadn't before. People weren't staring at her with pity or judgment. Instead, they were simply going about their day, caught up in their own lives. Deann realized that the only person who had been judging her all this time was herself. She had let fear dictate how she moved through the world, how she viewed herself. But now, with her head held high, she realized that her disability didn't define her, and neither did the cruelty of others. Deann found herself stopping at the same lemonade stand where she had been before, the one she had visited on the day of the confrontation. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if the memories of that day would come rushing back, but she pushed the thought aside. She wasn't the same person anymore. She had been changed, transformed, by the support she had received from the bikers. And as she paid for her lemonade and smiled at the vendor, she felt something shift inside her, a quiet strength that had taken root deep within her. As Deann continued her walk down the pier, she felt a subtle shift in the air. People looked at her, not with pity, but with curiosity, with recognition. She wasn't just the girl in the wheelchair anymore. She was Deann, a person worthy of respect, worthy of standing her ground. The bullies were nowhere in sight, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had reclaimed the pier for herself. No longer would it be a place of shame, of fear. It was her space now, just as much as it was anyone else's. Over the next few weeks, the bikers continued to check in on Deann. They didn't make a big show of it, but they were there in quiet, steadfast ways. Sometimes, it was just a quick word of encouragement as they passed her on the street or a friendly nod when she saw them at the pier. Carmen, in particular, would stop by every now and then, offering her a few quiet words of support that always seemed to come at the right time. Deann had come to recognize that the bikers weren't just offering her protection, they were offering her something more profound, a sense of belonging. She wasn't just a project for them, someone they had to protect out of obligation. They had welcomed her into their fold, treating her as an equal, and that meant more to her than she could express. The bond between Deann and the bikers became something deeper, something she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't based on pity or charity, it was based on mutual respect. The bikers had shown her that strength wasn't about being tough all the time or hiding behind walls of bravado. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it was hard, and knowing when to offer support and protection without expecting anything in return. Deann realized that the biker code of loyalty and respect wasn't just something they practiced among themselves, it was something they had extended to her, a reminder that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity. With each passing day, Deann's life continued to change in ways she hadn't expected. She began to take more risks, pushing herself further than she had before. She went to new places, tried new things, and started to see herself not as someone defined by her wheelchair, but as someone who was fully capable of experiencing the world. And through it all, the bikers remained her quiet supporters, her silent allies. They didn't need to make a fuss. They had shown her that the most powerful acts of kindness were often the quietest ones, the ones that didn't require recognition or applause. Deann was finally starting to see herself the way Carmen had seen her, stronger than she knew. Deann stood at the edge of the pier, feeling the familiar warmth of the sun on her face and the cool breeze from the ocean brush against her skin. It had become her ritual to visit this spot, to pause and take in the view. It wasn't just the beauty of the ocean or the energy of the pier that made her return. It was the way it made her feel connected to everything around her, to the world she had once felt so distant from. A sense of purpose had begun to grow in her over the past few months, an undeniable strength that had replaced the quiet fear that had once ruled her life. She no longer saw herself as someone defined by the wheelchair or the accident that had changed her life. No, Deann had come to understand that her true identity was defined by the resilience and strength she carried within herself. The world that had once seemed so daunting, so full of judgment and cruelty, now felt different. Deann no longer felt like a bystander in her own life. She had learned to step forward, to claim her space, and to face whatever came her way with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned their place. The bikers had shown her something that had forever altered her perception of herself. They had taught her that strength wasn't about physical ability or the image others had of her. It was about standing tall in the face of adversity and knowing your own worth. The people who had once made her feel invisible were no longer able to define her. In the months since that pivotal day on the pier, Deann's life had been steadily reshaped. The pain of her accident had not disappeared, but it no longer consumed her. She had found new ways to move through the world, new goals to pursue. She had even started attending therapy sessions, not just to help her body heal, but to help her mind and spirit grow stronger as well. It wasn't just about physical recovery anymore. It was about reclaiming her life in its entirety. She was finally starting to see the potential that had always been inside of her, the strength that had always been there, hidden beneath the weight of fear and doubt. Carmen and the bikers had become a part of her life, but not in the way she had once feared. They weren't just protectors, they were reminders. Carmen, in his quiet way, had shown her that true power lay in the ability to stand tall, to show up for others when they needed it most, and to offer support without asking for anything in return. The Mafia's presence in her life, while unexpected, had been a constant source of strength. She had learned that sometimes the most unlikely people could show you the greatest kindness, and that protection wasn't about physical force, it was about making sure someone was never left alone in the face of cruelty. And now Deann knew she was part of that same network of support. Deann's transformation wasn't just about her newfound confidence, it was about the way she had come to see herself and the world around her. She wasn't alone anymore, not in the way she had been before. The Mafia, once a symbol of fear and intimidation, had become a symbol of unity and loyalty in her eyes. They had shown her that no matter how small or powerless she had felt, she was worthy of respect, of kindness, and of protection. She had become, in her own way, a reflection of the lessons they had taught her, that no one should stand alone in the face of cruelty, and that even in the darkest moments, there were people who would rise to protect others. As Deann wheeled herself down the pier, she passed by the same places where she had once felt so small and invisible. But now, the pier felt like a space that belonged to her, a place she could claim as her own. She wasn't the same person who had arrived here months ago, afraid, unsure, and weighed down by the cruelty of others. Now, she was someone who had learned the power of solidarity, the importance of standing up for what was right, and the value of her own strength. People still looked at her, but this time, the stares weren't filled with pity or judgment. Instead, they were filled with respect, curiosity, and, sometimes, admiration. Deann had become someone who inspired others, even without trying. She had become a symbol of what it meant to stand tall, not despite her disability, but because of the strength she had developed in the face of it. Deann had learned to take pride in the life she was building for herself. She had begun to speak up more, to challenge the stereotypes that often came with her disability, and to help others who felt overlooked or unseen. She had started working with local organizations that focused on helping people with disabilities find independence and empowerment. It was her way of giving back, of passing on the lessons she had learned. She wasn't just a survivor of her circumstances, she was becoming a force in her own right, a person who could inspire change in her community. And, in a way, the bikers had helped her see that. One evening, as Deann sat on the edge of the pier watching the sun dip below the horizon, she thought about how far she had come. The ocean stretched out before her, endless and vast, much like the possibilities that lay ahead. She had once been paralyzed by fear, unable to see beyond the limitations she had placed on herself. But now, the world felt open to her in a way it hadn't before. She knew that there would be challenges ahead, there always were, but she also knew she was no longer the same person who had faced them before. She was someone who had learned the value of standing up for herself and for others. Someone who had found her strength, not in the absence of fear, but in her ability to move through it. Deann looked out over the ocean, the wind ruffling her hair, and smiled softly. She had come so far from the girl who had once been lost and afraid. Now, she was someone who could hold her head high and face whatever came her way, knowing that true strength came from within. And in that moment, she realized that her journey had just begun. The world was no longer a place to be feared, it was a place to be embraced. She was ready for whatever came next. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. There's another interesting one on your left screen that I think you'll really enjoy.